Dear viewers of Assyria TV, welcome to this interview here today. We have a professor with us here today in Islamic and Chinese studies. Professor, you are a very foremost scholar on this subject, and very famous around the world. You know a lot of languages. You speak Hebrew, you speak Arabic, English, Chinese, Korean, French, etc. Maybe I have missed out on some.
Malish.
Yeah. We're very honored to have you here with us today, and for the viewers of Assyria TV. And we would like to share your story with us and tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are.
Well, my name is Raphael Israeli. Not very much to tell. I was born in Morocco, and I came as a young boy to Israel, and my career has been scholarship at the Hebrew University, where I teach, as you said, Chinese and Islamic studies. So I have dealt with Islam in various parts of the world. First in the Middle East, where it is the core area of Islam, and then in Europe, you know, as Islam has been rising in Europe and also raising many problems in the various countries of Europe. And of course, Islam in Asia, especially in China, about which I have written a couple of books. So these are my topics of interest in the Middle East. And my last two books, which you might like to show, one is about ISIS, especially how it became an international issue. And as you know, tomorrow I'm lecturing on the topic in Uppsala, if any one of you is interested to come. And the other one is called Christianophobia. You know, the Muslims speak a lot about Islamophobia, so we have to counter that by saying that the Christian minorities, including the Assyrian, has been very harshly persecuted in the Islamic world, and the best proof of that is that you are here, not back in Iraq or Syria.
Professor, you, as you told us right now, you were born, you're from Morocco. And you left Morocco as a
age of 14,
yeah, and you left it because you were persecuted as other Jews. How did it feel to go to Israel, being forced to leave Morocco?
Well, you know, technically I was not forced to go, but when they make your life miserable, then without forcing you technically to leave, then you have to leave because you cannot take it. I remember my childhood as being raised in fear all the time. My grandfather came very often from work in the Medina, the Muslim part of the city of Fez, where I grew up, very bleeding and wounded and so on. And I was always asking, why is that so? So I was told, well, the Arabs did that. But why did they do it? Nobody knows. And the Jewish condition in Morocco has been like that for more than a millennium. Even before that, before the Arabs conquered the Maghreb, North Africa, there was a Jewish settlement there at least 500 years before the Arabs come. That means that the Arabs cannot say that they mistreated the Jews because they conquered them. On the contrary, the Jews were natives there, and it was the Arabs who came from the outside who conquered them and the local Berbers in Morocco. And therefore, even though my family didn't want to go, because you understand how it is, you have experienced it yourself, to be uprooted from your culture, your language, your country, your friends, your family, and to go to another place. So I felt exactly the same thing, but the conditions were so harsh that I said I prefer my dignity in a place where I can live freely, raising my head when I wanted and saying what I wanted, rather than living in relative comfort. My family was well off, but being humiliated day in, day out. And that kind of preference I decided to apply in the real life, and so I did.
Last year you published, as you told us, a major book on Christianophobia, which deals with both ethnic and religious persecution. How would you say your own life story has affected your interest in the persecution on the Assyrian Christians and other minorities in the Middle East today?
See, when I grew up as a child, I took oppression and discrimination and persecution and all those nice words, I took that as God-given. It's like a calamity, like a tsunami, like a bad weather. You can do nothing. It's given, that's it. People have been living under that for centuries. But then at the age of 14, when I grew up and learned more things, I came to the realization that it is not God-given, it's man-given. And therefore, if I cannot change it, I better leave it. And so I did. And therefore, I went alone. My parents didn't want to go at the time. I went in what is called in Israel the youth aliyah, that is going to immigration to Israel for youth, Jewish youth. And I went and lived in a boarding school in Israel and so on. And only 7 years later, after some of my brothers and sisters followed me as individuals, did my parents come. So, you know, these are formative years between 14 and 21. They left me, or I left them as a kid, and they found me as an officer in the Israeli army. They were very proud and so on. But that has changed my life completely. And then when I went into scholarship, university and so on, I said to myself that that epoch, that episode of Jewish life has to be investigated even further. And then I discovered that Jews are only one example of the harsh persecution that afflicted minorities all over in the Islamic world. And therefore, I decided, among other things, to study the various modalities of persecution of Jews and Christians in various parts of the globe. And that's what I have been doing. Now, the last book, Christianophobia, really reflects that movement from living in a sad reality of being oppressed and persecuted and so on, into a situation of freedom where I could say what and write what I want in a free country. And therefore I could expand my research and writing about the other persecuted people, of course, the majority of which are Christians. There are more Christians than there were Jews in the Islamic world. And still there are. Jews have almost totally abandoned the rule of Islam, while Christians, very unfortunately for them, many of them remain, especially Syria, Lebanon, some in Iraq, but many are leaving one after the other. I know very closely the case of my country, Israel, where Christians who are of Palestinian, let's say, nationality, have also been living very massively. The city of Bethlehem, which used to be majority Christian until about 30 years ago, now became majority Muslim. And the majority of Muslims cannot accept the fact that the Christians who once were dhimmis under the rule of Islam suddenly become the masters of the place. The mayor, for example, of Bethlehem was Christian for many years, and therefore basing themselves on their majority, new majority. By the way, that happened also in Nazareth, another Christian city which is under the rule of Israel. And so they decided to put pressure on the Christians so that they leave completely. But they, there is attachment to the Church of Nativity and other Christian sites, and therefore it's not very easy for them to go. And besides, and that gives an international dimension to the whole thing, the Pope and the Vatican in general pressures them to stay, not because they feel good there, but the Pope and the Vatican do not want to face a situation where the city of the birth of Christians is clear of Christians completely, and therefore they want some kind of representation to remain there.
I wanted to return back a little bit to this question regarding your own story, your own experience, you being persecuted yourself. What similarities and differences do you see between then and now regarding the persecution, the ongoing persecution today on the Christians?
Of course, there is a vast difference. First of all, the world has changed, because what was taken as a matter of course 50 years or 60 years ago, now it is watched very closely by the international media. When something happened to the Assyrians or to the civil war in Syria or to any other minority, so immediately you have all the international networks taking or making accounts of all that in detail. And therefore today there is much more, let's say, fear in the Arab and Islamic countries from being too exposed to the international criticism, and therefore they are much more cautious about doing that than before. In my time, when I decided to abandon Morocco and to go, nobody cared and nobody paid attention, because nobody knew. The media were not as immediate as they are today. That's a paradox, you see. The media are immediate. They bring immediate knowledge to the world about what is happening. And that is, of course, a vast difference. The other major difference is that at the time when I was persecuted, there were almost no Christians in North Africa. The Christians have been evicted already under the Muwahidun dynasty, and the Muwahidun were very, very strict Muslim, like the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia today. And they persecuted the Christians who had been there since the beginning of the Christian era, including under the Roman and the Vandal rule over North Africa. But the Muwahidun evicted them because they were very harshly persecuted, as they did to the Jews. But the difference was that the Jews had nowhere else to go, and therefore they had to absorb all those atrocities and stay, losing a lot of people to the forced conversions into Islam and so on. But the Christians had other countries, Europe, which was already Christianized, and therefore they ran to Europe exactly as the Assyrians are running today to Europe and America.
you mentioned about the Assyrians, and do you, are people in Israel aware of the persecution on the Assyrians as an indigenous people being wiped out, not only as Christians but as an indigenous people?
Yeah. Well, certainly not only in Israel. In Israel, we are more interested because it's next door, and the Christians who are being eliminated in in lots of places like Lebanon and Syria. Sometimes they run away to Israel to find refuge in Israel. So of course it makes us more immediately concerned with what's happening to the Christian minorities in the world. But I think due to the media, to the immediacy of the media, these things get instantly propagated all over the world. And therefore, in that regard, Israel or the Western world, which get free media, well-informed and free reporting, are as well informed about what's happening in the Middle East and each other.
I want to move on to another question. It's here in not only in Sweden, but Assyrians all over the world are very worried about the ongoing Kurdish land grabs in northern Iraq today. How would you describe the oppressive methods and tactics used by KRG on the Assyrians as an indigenous population in the northern Iraq today?
Well, this is a very fascinating question because you know, the Kurds, who are much more numerous than the Palestinians, there are some 30 or 40 million Kurds divided between 4 countries, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, have been vying for an independent state for the last 100 years. And they don't get it because the Kurds are divided between 4 countries, and the 4 countries are afraid to let them get independence because it's like a domino effect. If they get it in one country, the others will rise in the neighboring countries and also demand it. And that's the reason why it was stifled, strangulated over the years, and nobody seems to care about it. And that's the reason why the Kurds have not been in the focus of world interest like the Palestinians. Palestinians, they are fewer and more recent and so on, but nevertheless they get the attention of Europe, especially of Sweden, who has become their best ally and so on. Now the Kurds resent very much that situation because they think, and they think they are right, that they are more liable, they are more desirous of, and they are much more deserving of independence than the Palestinians. But Palestinians get it, and the world presses for it, while the Kurds are completely abandoned. And therefore, when they have the opportunity to take revenge on others, whom can they take revenge on? Not the countries which host them, like Turkey and Iran, which are strong states, but they take vengeance on the minorities who are helpless. Now, especially that in the case of the Assyrians, Assyrians are not territory bound. They are a minority. You find in Baghdad, you find in Basra, and you find in Mosul. They are everywhere. They are not territory bound. The Kurds have always been territory bound in what is called Kurdistan. And Kurdistan you find in Turkey, in Iraq, in Iran, and in Syria. And therefore, based on their territory, they can continue to claim their right for independence, and they show it by oppressing the minorities who don't have a territory, and therefore they have no base to stand against them. So it's a very tragic situation, but that's the reality. One has to understand what it is.
You mentioned that the Kurds have been territory bound, and that the Assyrians have been spread out in a lot of cities, not only in Iraq but also in Syria and Turkey and Iran as well. Do you think that the Assyrians being spread out on all these places does it have a relation between the authorities, like in the KRG area? There are a lot of Assyrians not being concentrated in one area. There have been a lot of demographic changes.
Of course.
What do you consider the KRG have had in a role affecting the Assyrians being spread out in demographical changes?
You know, I think the great tragedy of the Assyrians is that, unlike the Jews, they did not demand from the very beginning the revival of old Assyria. There was Assyria, an Assyrian kingdom, which even conquered Israel more than once. And if the Assyrians, not as a church, but as a people, had requested or required or insisted on the revival of their old kingdom of Assyria, maybe their situation will be much better today, because then they would have assembled in one territory and they would have made their claim very, very concrete, because they have a territory that they control. But unfortunately, by their own choice, I suppose, they did not do that. They let other dictatorial regimes, like in Iraq, like in Syria or Turkey, to rise, while leaving them as a small minority, divided between various countries, spread in various cities, and now it's very difficult to amend all that. Something that was not done from the beginning is very difficult to redo many years later. And I think that is the tragedy of the Assyrians, and that is the reason why you have here two contradictory processes. The Jews are assembling into Israel, the Syrians are disbanding into the outside countries. It's exactly a reverse process. And I think it's very tragic for the Assyrians.
You wrote that in your book that the Kurds have been acting like the Palestinians, both falsifying history in the Middle East, and with the Assyrians and the Jews both being an indigenous people in their respective countries. What are your views on cooperation between Israel and the KRG government?
Well, there can be, and there is, in fact, a lot of contact, a lot of collaboration between the two sides. But as I said before, it's not logical, because it's two contradictory processes. One gathers in one place, the Jews, and the others are dispersing all over the world, which is exactly the reverse. So it's very difficult, perhaps impossible, to bring these two contradictory processes into one junction where they can converge and really do something, except on the humanitarian level. If somebody needs medical help and comes to Israel, he is given medical help. If some people need, I don't know, all kinds of other humanitarian assistance, it can be extended to them. But on the political level, which is, I suppose, what you mean, it's much more difficult because there is no base for collaboration. One has territory, army, institutions, all what's needed for a state. The others have nothing. So you cannot make an orange collaborate with an apple. You need 2 oranges or 2 apples to grow in the same field. Otherwise it simply doesn't work. And unfortunately, I am saying, unfortunately, again, the historical development of the Assyrians, which was contrary to the process with the Jewish people who returned home after 2,000 years, while the Assyrians failed to do that when they had the chance, before the French mandate in Syria and before the English mandate in Iraq, before there was an Iraqi state or a Syrian state. Then the field was open for demands of the native people to go back to their original land. The Jews did that since the League of Nations, the San Remo Conference in the 1920s, but even the Kurds tried. But the Assyrians never did that. And I think now they are paying this very heavy price, for which I am deeply sorry, but I am afraid not much can be done.
Now that the Jews have their own country in the state of Israel, they know about persecution and how it is to not have a home.
Oh, yes.
The Assyrians, if you look at in Iraq, in 2003, there were approximately 1.5 million Assyrians. And that number today is a lot less. It's less than 500,000 living in Iraq today. What do you think that, or my question is, do you think that Israel would support the returning back home march regarding the Assyrians going back to their indigenous land, like Iraq and also Syria and Turkey?
You see, some time ago I was in Serbia, and they asked me the same question because the Serbians were ruling Kosovo, and now Kosovo became independent from them. And the Serbians asked me the same question: can they go back to Kosovo, which used to be Serbian? So I said to them, and I'm saying to you, in international politics, you don't get presents. If you want something, you have to go for it. You see, the Palestinians have learned that. They have learned the notion of sabr, persistence, to stick to your goal, to your territory, not to leave, whatever happens. Because otherwise, if you leave your territory, that means to the world that you are not attached to it, that you are ready to abandon it because of suffering or persecution, what have you. But if you stay put, despite all the problems, then you gain a credit, you gain let's say the right of possession to the land where you are. But unfortunately, as I said before, the Assyrians, and not only the Assyrians, other Christians in Lebanon and in Syria, have been doing that for the last century. They are leaving and leaving and leaving. Of course, the Muslims take their place, and they are not in a mood to give up anything back to the living Christians. So where do they go back to? They don't have anything to go back to. So because if you don't stick to it, as I said, this notion of sabr, you take it, you absorb it, and you stand fast. If you don't do it, you have lost it.
It's a little bit difficult I understand what you mean about you have to be persistent in staying in your own territory and not leaving. But when you're persecuted, it is sometimes very difficult to stick, or else you will get killed, and not only you, your whole family will get wiped out. But the Jews have also returned home when the state of Israel was formed. There were a lot of Jews returning home from all over the world.
That's right.
And what I meant with my last question was more that, do you think that Israel would support the Assyrians going back from, not only from Sweden, even from Germany, from the United States, because there are a lot of Assyrians that have been even if they are living in Western countries today, they would still want to go back home once again. So do you think that with the history of the Jews themselves, do you think that they would support the Assyrian cause to be able to go back and to recognize them as an indigenous people of that area, and to claim the rights on that area as well? Like, for example, the Nineveh Plains, together with the other minorities living there.
Well, this was exactly my point. I would support that if you have a place to go, because if you go back from Sweden to Iraq, you go back to a situation of minority among a majority of Muslims, who sometimes will be nicer, sometimes will be meaner, but you are still the minority under their boots, ruling you. When the Jews went back, they went back to a place which was independent, not as minority, but to create a majority Jewish state. But you are not in that situation. If you were, that's the reason why I said, if the Assyrians had cultivated the idea before there was an Iraqi state and Syrian state in the 20s and 40s of the previous century, all is well. Then you will get support not only from Israel, from anybody in the area who realizes the worth of the Assyrians as a cultivated, advanced minority and so on. But that's not the situation. And therefore, I personally think, instead of advising you to go back to Mosul, to wait for some Saddam Hussein to come and oppress you again, you are better off in Sweden or in Germany or whatever it is. But if one day you can make sure that you have a base territory to which you can return, I am the first one to demonstrate for you, wherever it is.
Professor, you have written a major book about recruitment and financing of ISIS. What are the relations between the ISIS and the KRG government, and what role did the KRG strategy play in the outcome for the minorities in the Nineveh Plains?
As you know, both America and Russia are ganging up against ISIS, everyone for a different reason. The Syrians because they want to maintain the Assad regime, the Americans because they want to remove the Assad regime. But both are collaborating because they know that ISIS is the main issue. Unfortunately for the Americans, all the groups that they are trying to help, that the Free Army of the Syrians, you know, all those names and so on, they did not do very well. They have been fighting for 5 years, not much progress. The progress is made by the other radical Islamic movement like Jabhat Nusra, who are really making gains on the Golan Heights and other places. And therefore, the Americans found out that the best fighting force against Assad and against other groupings who oppose the Americans are the Kurds. And therefore they are financing them, pushing them, giving them arms, giving them money, and so on, in order to try to wipe out Assad and his regime and all the territories they have under their rule. And therefore, under that situation, perhaps except for Jabhat Nusra, which is big enough in order perhaps to gain rule of large parts of the areas still ruled by Assad, that is western Damascus, Homs, Hamat, and the western part of Aleppo, which is now under siege and so on. All the rest is either under the threat of Jabhat Nusra or ISIS, and both of those are not great friends of Israel. And the only one who is pushed to fight against both are the Kurds, because they are willing to ensure their continued independence, even if Assad should remain on power, because now they are ensuring for themselves the northern parts of Syria, like Kamishli and so on, where they have strong bases. And recently there are also some towns like Manzij in northern Syria, where the fighting is still going on. And therefore, I think that from the point of view of Israel, its only concern is that nobody should come close enough on the Golan Heights in order to create troubles on the Israeli frontier with them. And therefore, anytime somebody comes close to it, the Israelis interfere, mainly with air power and so on. And so far it has worked. But we don't know how it will continue should Assad remain in power and or gain the upper hand with the help of the Russian Air Force. So things are so complicated and so many powers are involved in it that you can hardly understand what's happening today. Nobody knows what will happen tomorrow.
Well, the situation in Israel is that Israel has a border with Syria regarding the Golan Heights, but you were speaking more about the Kurds in Syria and how they are fighting for their future independence, but
Syria and Iraq.
Yeah, but do you, I mean, when ISIS started to grow strong in Iraq, what role do you think that the KRG had in northern Iraq to have ISIS grow strong? Mm-hmm. Do you think that the KRG collaborated with the ISIS in terms of land territories and I mean having deals under the table, not anybody aware of this, because there were a lot of the Kurds they draw themselves back before ISIS even invaded Mosul. They did it the same in the Nineveh Plains, and also in the Sinjar mountain. So my question is more like, what do you think that they have collaborated in terms of territories, dividing them up between ISIS and the KRG government? and I would love to hear your opinions about
well,
that.
Look, first of all, basically, I think that the Kurds care for the Kurdish interests, and ISIS cares for the ISIS interest. The ISIS never hid their ambition to have an Islamic caliphate, not only in Iraq and Syria, but to extend all over the Islamic world. And they already have a base in Sinai, which had sworn allegiance to them, and another one in Libya, which is also said, and even far away Western Africa, in Nigeria, where the Boko Haram has also stated they are loyal to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So the ambition of the ISIS seems to be strong enough, although in the last 1 year, especially due to the intervention of the Russian and the American air power, they have been losing some territory. Now the pressure is on Mosul to oust them from there and so on. Now, of course, the Kurds have totally opposite interests, because they want to maintain an Iraq where they have a very strong voice. As you know, Iraq is Shiite, Sunnite minority in the west, and the Kurdish area in the north. The Kurds want to rule Mosul and Kirkuk. Both of them are rich in oil and close to the Kurdish territory. And therefore, even if they make deals, I also heard of them, under the table with ISIS, it's only for local things. For example, if there is some Christian minority in some place which opposes the Kurds, so they can make an agreement with ISIS about how to get rid of that Christian minority. But as soon as they do that, they will turn against each other. Because this is a fact that the main fighters against ISIS today, I mean land fighters, are the Kurds. The Americans and the Russians can help from the air, but the great or the big decisive movements to reconquer the Syrian northern cities and all that are done mainly by the Kurds, and they pay the main price of their killed and wounded and so on and so forth, although they have massive support by the Americans.
Well, I want to move on to my last question. What do you think the future looks like for the Assyrians and other minorities in the Middle East after ISIS? And I would love to hear your...
Look, we hardly know the past. I was trained as a historian who studied the past. The future, nobody knows. I certainly don't know. Because there are things that happen which are beyond any logic or consideration. For example, before the Americans and then the Russians interfered with air power against ISIS, ISIS was certain in its own eyes and in the eyes of the world to conquer all Syria and Iraq very quickly, because they were gaining territorial time. There was nobody could stand them. And it was not logical to think that the Russians will bring air power or the Americans will bring air power, because Obama wanted to get out of the Middle East, not to get more involved. And here suddenly something happened that nobody could predict. The Americans are there and the Russians are there, and it turned the whole game over. So because there are so many unpredictable things that can happen. For example, if Trump is elected in the United States, he will have a totally different policy from what Obama has today, or Clinton will follow probably. So since we don't know those things, what will happen depends on whatever happens on the ground. And therefore, although I know foolish colleagues of mine who know everything that will happen tomorrow in a year. That's foolish, really. And to say that, because nobody really knows. A political scientist usually can tell you for sure what will happen in 50 years, because then they will not be around to realize that they were wrong. But I'm much more cautious than that. You say, be a little bit more modest and admit that you don't know what will happen tomorrow or what can happen tomorrow. Things change in the Middle East very, very quickly. And I hope things turn for the best. But to tell you for sure that this or that will happen, better admit that I don't know. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being with us here today. And thank you, the viewers of Assyria TV, for watching this show here today.